What's up, you guys? It's VDX. The Evo YouTube channel just interviewed the Tekken devs and asked about their philosophy and upcoming changes to Season 2. Now, the entire interview is in Japanese, so what I thought I would do is just read out the subtitles to you in case you want to hear what's going on, but you're busy driving, eating, sleeping, etc. All right, let's get started. I'll be reading a bit slower than I normally do, just because the subtitles move a bit more slowly than I would normally speak. Nakatsu says, "To me, I wanted Tekken 8 to make the series feel fresh. The keyword being aggressive. We aimed to make a fun battle system where it would be more offensive focused, where Tekken up until this point has been more defensive. In regards to making it feel fresh, I think it's going well. But on one hand, because offensive play is strong, it feels the game nature leans a little too much towards offense. On that part, I feel there's still much to be worked on. There are both good and bad sides to this, but I think we were able to freshen up one part within the system." He continues, "Alongside making a game where attacking is strong, by memorizing attack patterns, there's the aspect of anyone having fun and improving. There are a good number of new players that are beginning from Tekken 8. There's also a lot of players at various events that started with Tekken. Even at the Master Cup we participated in the other day, there were a lot of young participants we never saw before competing." Harada notes that they were really young. Michael Murray notes that there were a lot of women too. Skipping back a bit to catch the rest of what they said. Nakatsu said, "When we look at it as a title after a year, while there were places we succeeded quite a bit in Tekken development, I gather there are a lot of things to address going into Season 2. He notes that there are things that he'd like to improve. "We don't really intend on changing the aggressive nature of the game where it's fun to be the aggressor." And that's an important thing to note. But on the other hand, in Season 1, because it was constraining for defensive players, and the heat system made it easy to make matches pretty one-sided, in terms of strategy, I feel we weren't able to balance the defensive aspects that well. That's why for Season 2, we'd like to focus on defense in terms of the lateral aspects of a 3D fighting game, and the ease of defending when being attacked. I think that's a big deal. The heat system is the starting point and factor in which your attacks can get really explosive. Theories get created on how a player or character should win to a certain degree." Harada says battle strategy theories. Nakatsu says, "Yes, it's correct that people theorize these things. In order to expand upon this in Season 2, we're doing a particular thing. Expand upon the battle strategies. When you're in heat state and taking a lot of damage on the ground..." What's he going to say? "We're adding the ability to recover about 30% health from the actual damage inflicted." Wow. Okay. "In doing so, you now have the strategy of fighting while preserving your heat gauge. I'll have to see this in-game. I'm not sure what this means. Up until now, the correct action when you activated heat was either to heat smash or rush down your opponent utilizing the unique individual power-up properties of heat. But by preserving heat, strategies are expanded upon." Okay. "So saving your meter, allowing you to fight in more advantageous ways in neutral, compared to when not using heat. Also this time, there are a number of characters that are now able to use Heat Burst and Heat Smash from their special stances as well." That's a huge change. "By doing this, you now have strategies where you can use heat bursts that stop an opponent's attack by utilizing stances. If we change the way people activate their heat burst, it can expand the way players utilize heat to attack. In that way, there are more things you can do than in Season 1. The reason why we made it so you could crouch after heat engagers was for characters like Anna, who have two strong choices from crouching. Because had we left it in Season 1 where you could only stay standing, characters would lose out on the merits of their kits. Of course, there are other characters aside from Anna with a strong crouching game that would suffer since they couldn't crouch. I'm thinking like Yoshimitsu, Dragunov, Law, Shaheen. To remedy that, we made it so players can now crouch. Okay, yes. Murray says, I think the thing that people don't understand, that when creating a game, you have to have a solid key concept. If you don't uphold that, the game won't be interesting. Harada says it'll break down. Murray says, so we don't waver from being aggressive. In doing so, it guarantees a degree of fun. There are places where it might be unfair, so rather than tossing the concept out, you just fix wherever the unfairness is. Nakatsu adds, basically fixing, nerfing, or reducing the frequency of wherever it's unfair. And Harada says it's not a case of zeros and ones. People think it's as simple as 0 and 1. Harada says, like we believe that we have a good balance, but nothing in the world goes that well. Anytime you raise one, the other will drop. Should you raise both, it ends up being half-baked. So you end up losing out on the good aspects. Whenever you raise the other, whatever you raise, the other needs to drop. When you look at the reactions regarding Tekken 8 and where it changed most, this is Harada again, a lot of the negative feedback, surprisingly, came from the veterans. That's not very surprising to me, personally. But Harada says, much of the dissatisfaction, surprisingly, came from the people who had been with the series for a long time. Conversely, there are people who thought Tekken 8 was interesting. For example, whether or not Tekken 8 is easy for new players or not is a different story, like completely different. People that are able to overcome that wall and find it interesting end up liking the structure of Tekken 8. That's why they say Tekken 8 is interesting. And then, in regards to strategy balance, if we try to balance it more towards the preference of the veterans, of course the satisfaction of the people that originally found Tekken 8 interesting will drop. So it's quite a trade-off there. But all things considered, we see by how much an aspect might be too extreme. And honestly, we balance while monitoring. The subject of where, I'm assuming he says where to balance, is not very simple. It's super minute in the degree, or rather minute in the adjustments that are made. When you look at the results from esports and the game as Season 1, Michael Murray said, Nakatsu and I were talking about this, we were expecting unknown people to pop up in Season 1. Harada says, there's a rise in people that weren't able to be active until now, or even unknown people. But conversely, in the end, people who are skilled go to the high ranks. They end up climbing ranks. But the characters that win or are the top 8 characters are actually quite scattered. Especially with 7, people like veterans mostly would question why certain characters or players kept winning. Especially back in Tekken 7, I think is what he means. People like veterans that complained are actually the ones who got the best results in Tekken 8. Based on the results, Tekken 8 seems to be it for them. So, another interesting thing is veterans also complain about how they don't really like the new system. The inconsistency is kind of funny. What stands out and what doesn't. We do our best to see to it that everything comes to a fine balance. This is still Harada speaking. But looking at the results from esports, it seems good and going the way we imagined it. Michael Murray says, I spoke about this with Nakatsu, and the thing that makes the game a good product, I'm excited to see what he says next, is that people that have never played Tekken that start from 8 can have the feeling of, if I actually try, even I can win. But they're obviously not going to be able to beat Mishima Star. Mishima Star is an old head. I haven't seen him in forever. Harada says, right. They're likely not going to win. Veterans are veterans for a reason, says Harada. Murray says, we won't say it's perfect. Nakatsu says, having the chance to win is important in continuing to play fighting games. Harada says, that's true. Managing that is difficult. Nakatsu says it's important to have the feeling of, yeah, I might win the next one. The reason why we're improving the movement aspect is the fact that Tekken 8's game nature is aggressive. In 3D fighting games, you can use lateral movement as a defensive maneuver to dodge attacks. Yes, that is by design. With lateral movement, or rather, since you can buffer sidesteps, interesting to use the buffer. Depending on how your opponent attacks, you're able to evade. Buffing that defensive aspect is one thing that we're measuring. Another thing is how for the entirety of the Tekken series, you couldn't crouch sidestep into the foreground while crouching. Right? So that's a big change coming to Season 2. The new players that started from 8 found it difficult to understand why you couldn't do that despite being able to move laterally. So they're explaining the change of sidestepping from crouch into the foreground. Even for us who've played the series, we didn't know why. So we wanted to fix that. In order to buff the defensive aspect and to improve on a point that didn't make sense for new players, we made it so people can move sideways into the foreground while crouching. Characters can move better to respond to attacks, strengthening defensive movement. Those are the changes that we're adding. Murray says it wasn't intentional, but rather it was a technical limitation. Harada says, yes, we're sorry. Harada says, we're sorry, we wanted to make it that way, but it was difficult then. It was a scripting issue, says Murray. Nakatsu says it required engineering and would take time. Sorry, I have to rewind. It was required engineering and would take time, so we just weren't able to do it until now. Murray says, based on that, players would create strategies. Harada says, right, and it became kind of a strategy within Tekken. Murray says, for example, Kazuya's axe kick. They can't move into the foreground, so I'll do this, is basically what happened. Nakatsu says, that's why by adding the option to move sideways, it improves the defensive aspect, allowing players on the receiving end to test new plays against their opponent's attack. So it's interesting to me that the dev team has acknowledged that there's a built-in metagame based on that technical limitation. It's cool that they, have recognized that. For attackers, they need to figure out how to adapt to that. It's a new field of strategy. Harada says there's a lot of situations where it won't be a 50-50, which is a good thing. Murray says, for me, I like that nerfed kick from Dragunov we showed on the Tekken Talk Live. They're talking about the Pokemon style Ghost v Ghost. They showed gameplay where QCF4 doesn't hit on the ground anymore. Murray says, all the players online would spam that move so much. I really liked that they changed that. Harada says, now that's really specific. Nakatsu says, you seem to have suffered a lot personally. Murray says, a lot of damage. The thing I wanted to say is, for whatever reason, people think that I made that decision with Harada-san. Harada says, that's not true. Murray says, yeah, people on Twitter. That's not it. We have roles on the team. And Murray says that his role at the start of the project was working with Nakatsu to nail the key concept of aggressiveness. In my current role, says Murray, I play the game a lot and give feedback with the player's feelings in mind. This is pretty bad if it's a 50-50 here. Nakatsu, do something. That's what I keep doing there, right? And Harada says, yeah, you say that honestly. Murray says, that's why I buy the fight passes for PC and PS5 and complete both, probably to get a sense of both player bases. With that, I can go, a portion of players here are just being salty, but a portion of players might have a point here. That's why for me, it has to be Dragunov's kick, ignition switch. Harada says he got pretty specific there. Nakatsu follows up. Also, it's not really an adjustment point, but in Season 2, I wanted to make it easier for people like beginners to understand. So, as a first for the Tekken series, you'll see things like combo count, counter hit, and punish mid-battle. As VDX here, I have a lot of opinions about that. Harada says things that are only in practice mode normally. Nakatsu says, right. When people actually see pop-ups like clean, they can go, oh, I was able to counter here, or this is a pretty big damage combo. Editorial note, can't you just look at the health bar for that? Anyways, sorry. Let's keep going. It's the first time that you could see this visual change during battle, which is a big change. I was kind of worried that it might be a bother or clutter to some, and thought maybe we shouldn't go through with the plan. But when we actually released it, it was easy to understand after all. I'm assuming in internal testing. Even when I'm playing, it feels good to know that a punish works. I agree with that. I think punish is a good one. That's why Nakatsu says he likes it. Harada says, I was pretty obstinate about that. I said, don't you dare put that in. And Nakatsu responds, right, a long time ago, you said don't do that. So this is a big deal. Harada says, me and Kimoto-san hated that. I'm not familiar with who Kimoto-san is on the team. If you can let me know in the comments, that'd be cool. Harada says, we hated it. The change to display numbers itself. Old head arcade perspective. Nakatsu says, did it seem difficult to see? And Harada says, no, it's more so it becomes everything. I'm curious what he means by that. We basically wanted players to think about it themselves by not displaying numbers. Kind of like an arcade style perspective. As for combos, if you can just see how large the combos can get, you get controlled by how high or how low combos can get. So conversely, we felt it was more interesting even if you didn't know those values. That's an interesting perspective. But recently, the thing that's changed since back then, there are a lot of people watching streams where they want to know what's happening. So this is where Harada's saying that this is for audiences as well. In addition to experiencing the same feelings as a player on the stream, this means that the number of players this time playing from home have increased. The times then were different compared to now. We really wanted to show people how interesting the analog Tekken was. That's why I said no. But this time, I'm open about it. Nakatsu says, that's really big. Throughout the year, there was no arcade version of Tekken 8. And ended up being the first game to launch simultaneously for home consoles. It was difficult for us, but at one point within the seasons, it felt like we had a 1.5 since the amount of changes we needed to add were as big as 2. I think he's talking about the defense patch, where they made heat bursts not tracking and throws not tracking, among other changes. Despite that, there were a lot of things we wanted to improve, says Nakatsu. There were places the players enjoyed and places that they felt dissatisfied with. As a team, we picked up the individual voices of players. Michael really worked on the patch notes. We wanted to meet the expectations of players with Season 2. So we debated over things and tried to improve things in earnest. A lot of things changed in terms of fighting there, but there's also a lot of things that are fun too. I'm assuming he means in Season 2. I sincerely hope you enjoy the adjustments found with your character, in addition to the changes made to the battle system, and the visual changes to the UI we talked about earlier that displays information. You can enjoy all the new things. I hope you try everything, all the small things included, and give us your feedback. Okay, so that was the entire talk. Thanks for sticking through with that. My thoughts. A few things. Very promising in my mind that they actively stated they wanted to make lateral movement better, right? They acknowledged that the defense, or that the offense was too one-sided, right? I think that's a huge admission to make. I think that there was so much criticism about the Tekken devs like not listening or not paying attention or not understanding. This shows at least a base level they understand that the problem is that the offense was too one-sided. I think the insight that they're trying to balance between veterans and casuals is maybe a bit obvious. But it's cool, again, to hear them actually publicly say it, right? That we do care about the veterans, but when you buff something for the veterans, it becomes difficult for the beginners, right? Like paraphrasing, obviously, but I think that's an important thing. They prioritize the feeling of maybe I can win. Now, I think this is a consequence of maybe like the online era of games. I feel like when it was arcades or offlines, you're sitting next to somebody. If somebody's way better than you, generally they will try to give you tips and pointers to like improve and like to give them a chance, right? Like if you watch my Lily Pichu coaching sessions, she figured out that part really quickly. She'll be in a voice call. She's like, yeah, so this move you want to block low when she's fighting like Saikuno. And then she'll do the mid and it shows you, yeah, but here's the mix up, right? I think the online aspect of fighting games and the move to online is probably part of the consequence of that. And that actually plays into my perspective on the counter hit confirms and the on-screen text that they talked about, right? So Nakatsu talked about adding on-screen text when you land a combo or a punish or things like that. And I think for my full thoughts on that, I have a video on the second channel that I'll link below. But I'm generally against it in the sense that I think Tekken has historically given you ways to recognize these things outside of just hit sparks, outside of just notifications. I think Tekken has a lot of string offense and slower startup frames that give you the ability to kind of recognize these things with training, right? Going into practice mode or playing tons of sets against players and trying to counter hit confirm these things, you can feel yourself get faster as like a player, as like a human. And for me, I really value that feeling of improvement and speeding up. That's why I was generally against these changes. Yeah, here's the on-screen text. It says like tornado here. That's a big one. But again, my full thoughts are in the other video. What I will say though, is that the move to rollback netcode and how that affects the fluidity of Tekken movement reading, I think arguably makes this necessary. In past Tekkens, you could really fluidly determine someone's position on screen and watch them close the gap, watch them hit a button. So if they were running into you and you did a string and you saw that they just twitched like they were about to do a jab, good players could confirm that and you could train yourself to confirm that. However, with rollback netcode, if a Mishima player is wave dashing at you, they're teleporting all over the screen, right? So I feel like this is an important compromise when it comes to that. The trade-off, of course, is there are some characters for example, Yoshimitsu, that have some nasty hit confirms that are not really viable in a full game, or like in a fully full speed game situation. But with this on-screen text, as shown in Street Fighter, there are people who use the visual notifications to identify these things. So, for example, I have it set to random counter hit, and I'm just looking for the counter hit spark here. I have to put my sword away. If I get the counter hit spark with the 2 jab, I can confirm it into flash. He hasn't done a single one. Yeah, I have player counter on shuffle, so I'm not tripping. There. That's a natural combo right there. So with on-screen text that shows you that it was a counter hit, things like that become way more viable. And that becomes not just a balancing issue, but, well, honestly, that is what it is. It becomes a balancing issue, right? So I think that already the counter hit spark makes people able to confirm things that were much harder to confirm before. Great examples like Dragunov's 1-2-1. If you watch the pro scene, Dragunov 1-2-1 constantly is being used, and that's because it's so viable to hit the first 2 buttons, see the spark, and then finish the string if you see the spark, right? So it's not happening here, so I'm just going to do my safe high mid jab string, but if I see it, I can just finish it and end up murdering somebody for it. I messed up. I'm not a pro player. But yeah, that's a crucial example of how it's not as simple as just clarity. There's also balancing issues and kind of, I think, making things easier, not necessarily in a gatekeepy way. I don't want it to seem like there's a gatekeep factor to this. That's not my point. My point is that by demanding a skill check on these things, we can actually improve and grow in our speed as like technical fighting game players. And I love that aspect of it. It's not about preventing other people from doing it. It's about imposing a skill check so that I can improve and like rise up to that. The one thing I do like, I actually think the punish one is pretty good. If you think about how this is designed for newer players and beginners, I think that the punish display is actually really, really good. I think that realistically, asking people to go into practice mode is consistently an issue. Asking people to look up the frame data is consistently an issue. Showing punish and allowing people to just play the game and figure things out is a good thing, I think. To me, that doesn't represent a balancing issue necessarily, because a punish is a punish, right? That's purely a learning tool. It doesn't have the competitive advantage of seeing, you got a counter hit, run your offense, or finish the string, or, you know, do these other things, right? So a good point was raised by someone in chat that if you give it a delay so that it can't be used for a hit confirm, that would be really, really good. One other point I wanted to bring up related to this is they talked about visual clutter not bothering them. And I want to test it out before I give a solid conclusion on this. But if I go to my replay mode, a lot of VOD review, especially among like if you get coaching from like a pro, coaches will often ask you to remove a lot of the UI. Obviously, this is coach by coach and player by player. But when your focus is heavily on the spacing, the character models, the movements, and things like that, every bit of visual clutter actually does like matter. I'm not saying this just to be dramatic. But we will watch our replays with like the inputs off, right? If you're troubleshooting your own gameplay, I actually encourage having inputs on to see if you're making a mistake. But when we're doing like strategic analysis or like, am I playing the matchup well? What is my spacing like? In those cases, we often turn a lot of these things off because we know the frame data, we know the situations, we're just looking at the actions taken. And sometimes we'll even take off like the high, middle, low thing, right? Tekken is a game that there's so much to analyze and pay attention to just in with each character's movements and the moves they're choosing. So as much as visual noise probably is not going to be that big of a distractor at most levels, I do think it does matter that sometimes it can get in the way. So obviously we'll have to test it out, and I don't want to give a concrete opinion on it until I've actually gotten to try it. But that's my initial reaction to those changes. Aside from that, I'm really happy that I think they openly admitted that the offense was too one-sided. I think it's rare that you'll see devs really make these kinds of admissions, at least in the games I've played. I feel like to acknowledge that they swung too far the other way, openly state that, yeah, we want to stick with the offensive aggression component, but give defenders better options, is pretty cool. And then the next thing I'm curious about, they talked about like the preserving heat strategy. I want to see what that was about. Let me scroll around, see if I can find it. this seems interesting to me in a couple ways, because currently the heat system, like they said, is you either use your heat smash or you just start like beating somebody up and going crazy and trying to use your god mode as quickly as possible. But they're saying when you're in the heat state and taking a lot of damage on the ground, so maybe you're specifically grounded, we're adding the ability to recover about 30% health from the damage inflicted. What is that about? Does it involve spending the rest of your heat gauge? It says you have the strategy of fighting while preserving your heat gauge. What does that mean? You know, I want to see, and maybe they'll reveal it in the Tekken talk later tonight, which I'll also be doing a summary video on, that will address what this is. Because I'm so curious what this heat preservation, heat restoration thing is. Maybe you heal more if you still have a heat gauge, right? So like if you still have your heat gauge in reserve, like you haven't activated it, then you heal more. Or yeah, heat burst from the ground. There's so many things that could mean. So I really want to know what they have to say about that. But that's about the end of my thoughts. This has gone on long enough. Thank you for sticking around. Hopefully the read-through was smooth. I tried to match the pace of the subtitles. Translating is not my forte, so it's the best I could do. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed that, please leave a like and a comment. Let me know. And we'll be covering the Tekken talk in a later video coming soon. Thanks so much. See you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.